Good morning. Today we're going to talk about the effects of the railroad and the effects of Western migration on the Native Americans. But let's review from last week a little bit. We talked about the settlement of the West after the Civil War, and that we had three groups predominantly who moved west to help with that settlement, namely the miners, and then the ranchers, and then of course the farmers. None of this really would have been possible without the ongoing development of railroads. Now, railroads had been built prior to the Civil War, but they, of course, focused in the eastern part of the country, and particularly the north. Once the Civil War is over, the government resumes planning of a transcontinental railroad, a railroad that goes from the Atlantic coast to the Pacific coast. And so work begins on building that railroad immediately after the war ends. This, of course, is going to greatly reduce the amount of time it takes to travel from one coast to the other. It's also going to make it much safer. There's no problem with rain, Indian attacks, snow drifts, all of those things that settlers faced when they traveled by wagon are going to be greatly reduced. Now, that's not to say there weren't still disasters or problems that could occur with the railroads, but it was much safer, although not foolproof. As more and more Americans move onto the Great Plains, we see the Native Americans respond as we would expect them to, in that they are going to try to defend their homelands and their way of life. One of the first things that we do, the government does, is, well, let me back up and let's give it a little history. First of all, let's title this section Factors Eroding Native American Control of the West. Factors eroding Native American control of the West. Before the Civil War in 1830, we had the Trail of Tears, if you'll recall, and this was the forced removal of all Native Americans from east of the Mississippi River to west of the Mississippi River into what they called Indian Territory, which is modern-day Oklahoma. And so as the country expands west, even from our very early colonial beginnings all the way until after the Civil War, the Indians are forced further and further west. After the Civil War, when we have huge amounts of people moving west and the building of the railroad, the Homestead Act, which is promising free land, we see more and more problems develop between settlers and the natives. And so the government sends the army to the Great Plains to protect settlers, and we have a series of Indian wars, or the Plains Indian Wars is what you might call this. And an example of this is when General Custer was defeated by the natives. Another factor that led to the destruction of the natives is going to be the destruction of their natural environment, particularly the buffalo. The Plains Indian way of life is dependent upon the buffalo. They used buffalo for everything from shelter to clothing, utensils, tools. No part was wasted, and so they were very particular, and they didn't take more than they needed. As the whites move further and further west, the buffalo hide in particular is going to become valuable for hats and coats back east, but the rest of the buffalo is going to be left to rot on the plains. And as a result, buffalo become almost extinct by the time we get almost to 1900. So without the buffalo, the Plains Indians cannot continue the way of life that they had led for hundreds of years. Government policy in reaction to this is to put the natives on reservations. And these were large pieces of land given to the various tribes, and this is where they were supposed to stay in the confines of these areas to do their hunting. The problem with that is they were relatively small, and if buffalo didn't happen to come through that section of land for a while, then they starved. And so they become more and more dependent on the federal government to provide food and blankets and shelter and things like that. The reservation system didn't work very well, and as the Indians followed the buffalo, they were often caught outside their reservations, which resulted in conflict and wars between the Army and the natives. So they changed the policy from reservations to Americanization with the passage of the Dawes Act, D-A-W-E-S, the Dawes Act. The Dawes Act said that instead of keeping the natives separate on reservations, let's Americanize them, assimilate them into American society. And so they took the reservation land, divided it up, gave small plots, excuse me, gave small plots to all of the different families for farming. Well, the problem is, we already know it was very difficult to farm on the Great Plains, and these people weren't farmers, they were hunters. And so their dependency on the federal government is going to continue to grow. Some of that reservation land was sold. For example, in Oklahoma, when they opened up the land, most of you probably know that the University of Oklahoma's mascot is the Sooner. What's a Sooner? It was a person who jumped the start time to claim land in Oklahoma, so they went in too soon. Throughout this, the Indians, their numbers deplete, and they become more and more dependent on the federal government. Finally, and not until 1924, American Indians are going to be granted citizenship in the United States. Yes, all of the other groups, including former slaves, immigrants from foreign countries, could be naturalized, but Native Americans were not U.S. citizens until 1924. And this is the American Indian Citizenship Act. We'll get to this in a little later, but what we see now is we still have reservations. They are few and far between. They are small. A good portion of Native Americans, in some way or another, remain dependent on the federal government. And so our treatment of the Native Americans is not one of our shining moments in the United States. The fact is they were looked at as a hindrance. They were in the way of land that would help keep the United States prosperous. And so we'll end with the Native Americans, and we will talk later about sort of a resurgence of Native American pride as we progress throughout the course. But if you can remember the Dawes Act, the reservation system, and the importance of the buffalo, you'll have a pretty good grasp on the treatment of the Native Americans. Also keeping in mind, of course, that without the railroad, none of this settlement would have been possible. And the railroads are going to make some people in the country extremely wealthy. Our next topic for tomorrow will be on what's going on in the cities. While all of this is happening in the West, we know Reconstruction is going on in the South. What's going on in the cities of America after the Civil War?